morning, everyone. I'm Nathaniel. I'm joined by Matthew, Jessica, and Henish, and we are your Deloitte team for the high-speed rail evaluation for the FRC. We have defined the problem statement as being what is the most efficient, equitable, and valuable use of FRC funds to expand current rail systems in a safe, beneficial, and feasible way. Some of our impacts we have found to be enhanced mobility and interconnectivity in building and growing communities and cities while allowing people to move freely between cities and within them. Increased employment, creation of not only short-term construction jobs, but long-lasting career opportunities. Growth in tourism and economic development, especially in these tough fiscal times, lasting changes are needed with sustainable income. Perhaps high-speed rail stations can appeal to these needs. Reliable transportation, specifically with fewer delays. In France, high-speed trains suffer only 2 or 3 faults, defined as delays of 5 minutes or more, for every 621,000 miles they've traveled. Diminished environmental impacts, specifically of alternative transportation. Decreased greenhouse gas emissions, runoffs, and congestion compounding these issues are lessened by using high-speed rail. Improved safety, again, compared to alternative transportation. High-speed rail is much safer than driving. In 45 years in Japan and 28 years in France, there has never been a single fatality on a high-speed rail line. Turn it over to Matt now.
Some of the barriers to HSR development, high-speed rail development, that are reflected in our criteria include a lack of a complementary infrastructure. If you can get to another city via high-speed rail, do you have the ability to navigate the city once you get there? Of course, in some cities like DC and New York that have highly developed public transit systems, this isn't a problem. But in other communities, the scarcity of comprehensive public transportation might leave someone stranded at a station. Secondly, visibility. Capital projects like this must be careful in spending government tax money. The public wants to see their hard-earned dollars go to sensible projects that provide much-needed services, not boondoggles or bridges to nowhere. Ridership concerns. Is there sufficient demand for high-speed public transit to justify the sizable investment of tax dollars? Transit sector competition. High-speed public transit must be able to compete in time and money with airplane and automobile industries. Jurisdiction conflicts. Projects must anticipate and solve conflicts inherent in cross-boundary and cross-funded projects. Land usage. High-speed rails cannot use existing rails, so additional land may need to be purchased for those new rail lines. And a lack of long-term funding. President Obama's stimulus that infused $8 billion into the FRC is not an annual appropriation. Projects must be forward-looking, considering the long-term maintenance and operation costs. Will these projects require subsidies, much like Amtrak, to survive? Can state and local governments handle this? Our 4 major stakeholders include Congress, state and local governments, environmental groups, and the American people. And what Congress is looking at is accountability. Any transit system is visible. High-speed rail is a new transport concept that Americans are waiting to see take hold. For this very visible project to survive, it needs broad-based support. Congress wants to see that its $8 billion will be used to dramatically better American lives. With these $8 billion, while these $8 billion are a one-time appropriation, renewed funding may depend on transit funds and benefits being spread across the country, not concentrated in favored pockets. State and local stakeholders. These groups will be given clear guidelines on how to structure a comprehensive and successful project. Thorough criteria will help these groups determine whether high-speed rail is right for them. Environmental groups. While high-speed rail carries its own environmental challenges, my colleague Nat shared the net positive benefits resulting from a greater reliance on high-speed rail. And finally, and most importantly, the American people. How FRC allocates taxpayer money must be transparent, sensitive to public perception, as well as the project costs and benefits. A few assumptions we used in establishing our evaluation criteria include first, that the money we have to work with is a one-time allocation. We hope that we might get additional funds in the future. But right now, the FRC must weigh sustainability and long-term local funding heavily in its evaluation criteria. Secondly, high-speed rail, we believe, is the best solution for safe, efficient, mass public transit, as opposed to other new transport alternatives. Third, FRC has the resources to evaluate applications in depth, as well as provide localities and states with the resources and information necessary to complete the grant application. And finally, the American economy is capable of supporting high-speed rail manufacturing. From rails to trains, the high-speed rail system will be American through and through.
Thanks, Matt. So now we're going to let you know how we implemented those impacts and barriers through our direct support system that we developed for the FRC. So this is an outline of our criteria for evaluation. We paid particular focus to the request of the FRC to look at the dual bottom line for both the government costs and the public benefits and weigh them equally here. We also, as secondary priorities, established criteria of implementation and feasibility, which Hennish will discuss in detail shortly. So first priority is our costs. Thanks, Matt. Not only are we sensitive to the needs for the government to be accountable to the public for all spending, but this is a particular concern given the fiscal constraints of the current recession. So first of all, we'd like to look at the ratio of local to federal funding. With only $8 billion available, you'll want to make sure that localities are prepared to fully invest in these projects. The ratio of funding should be a leading consideration. The localities that are looking to invest more in their projects and maybe rely less on federal funds demonstrate a higher degree of ownership over their projects and a larger stake in the long-term project success. Next, we'll look at how the project is funded. It's important to evaluate applications on whether the project is funded by debt, subsidies, perhaps user fees. We want to know whether the current generation or maybe the future generations of users are bearing more of the burden for the cost of these projects. This criterion should also encompass the current level of debt that's encumbering any local or state entity or group that's applying for the funding. This can provide a view of our main concern for the long-term maintenance costs and operations. Also, we'd like to know if public-private partnerships are being leveraged. This will show support of the business community that you may need to get access to rail lands and other resources. Finally, for costs, we want to know whether high-speed rail will truly be competitive in the region. Are there other transport options available that may be cheaper, may be just as fast, or may be preferred, and therefore affect ridership? Next, and equally as important as cost, we're looking at the public benefits. Since the stimulus funds are highly visible, as Matt explained, you'll want to ensure that all plans are geared towards delivering the greatest public benefit to the greatest number of people. Quantitative criteria include whether travel time is improved and by how much. Are these trains truly high speed? Throughout the world, there are many levels of speeds that these trains are achieving, and we want to make sure the ones in the United States are competitive with other modes of transportation. We'll also want to look at quantitative measures of the current level of carbon emissions in these localities and states and what they project the impact would be in decreasing that from high-speed rail. How many short-term and long-term jobs will be projected to be established by high-speed rail? Will there be just construction jobs that fall off? Do they anticipate a greater economic impact? And what is the quantitative measure of that? Finally, we have an equity concern, particularly as visibility is concerned. Will there be different classes of train cars? Will there be senior discounts or student discounts? And how are you getting all different socioeconomic groups engaged in the process and making it affordable to everyone? For qualitative measures of public benefits, we've established how many people take this route in cars every day, how much traffic can be diminished. Is it a commuter route? Is it a tourist route? And how many people will this high-speed rail really serve? It's important to consider whether there are plans in motion to build new transport hubs to accommodate the high-speed rail. It would also be another demonstration of public-private partnerships. Perhaps malls or other commercial areas are already being developed to support a new high-speed rail infrastructure. Finally, is travel easier and more comfortable? Are there plans for Wi-Fi or a dining car? Will it improve my quality of life? If I'm riding this train every day, is it preferable to me to driving my own car? Is it actually more convenient, and is it actually saving me time?
A third criteria is implementation. The budget's one of the main things that we have to look at, and a lot of these projects go over budget. As we've seen, prime example is the big dig in Boston. We all know how that went. So how much of a safety net do we have with the budget? What about long-term operating and maintenance costs? Have those been planned for? And will it be sufficiently funded with the fares, or are there going to have to be subsidies from local and federal governments? Are taxes going to have to be raised? Those are all things that we'll need to know when we get these applications and to figure out how this is going to work long-term. As far as the American companies that are involved, there's going to be several peripheral railroad industries, whether it's making the trains, the rails, the retail shops that are affiliated with the expanded stations, and all the employees that will be working at all these places. Are these companies capable and ready to expand with the expansion of high-speed rail in these areas? Does the applicant's plans have quotes from these vendors to make sure that they have experience with high-speed rail, or have at least good strategies to plan for when they get implemented? The individual oversight, who's making sure there's no fraud or wasted funds? And that kind of goes with the accountability. We know that the Federal Rail Commission is responsible and at least has some external oversight, but who's on the inside that's looking at the development itself and making sure there's no costs and spending overlays? And what's their track record? Have they done this before, and are they familiar with these types of projects? The contractor themselves, what's their safety record? Obviously, it's of utmost importance to the Federal Rail Commission. We have to know what their track record is to make sure that they're building and maintaining and operating these trains with no loss of life and or harm. Specificity, how specific is the plan? Is it broad and overreaching, or does it say, here's our phase one, going from point A to point B with specifics of when they're doing it, when it'll be completed? Can the plan be rolled out in phases? Will it be usable in phases? What are the timelines for this? Is this in the near future? Are there realistic timelines too? And the federal law itself, have the laws been analyzed to make sure that when these high-speed rails get put in, that no new legislation has to be passed for sound or speed or other ordinances that might be violated? And if not, has legislation been at least written up so they can be fast-track approved when we do get funding? Feasibility is our fourth criteria. And it's basically determining if the applicant has planned for the unexpected. Is it worth putting in high-speed rail in the areas that they're proposing? Population density is a concern. What's our target audience? What percentage of the population will get to use these services? Contingencies in terms of cost and time overruns. Will construction companies be held accountable to discourage going over budgeted time and money? And how are they going to be held to that? That kind of goes back to the accountability. Localities, this is important. How many people are cooperating? How many neighborhoods and cities and states are cooperating? The more that we have that are benefiting from this, the more likely that I think the FRC would want to give funding to them. If it's tying together massive cities or interstate travel, that's a bigger benefit than just within one city. Now, is it shovel ready? Is there an agreement with the contractors on where and how it'll be built? Who owns the land? Is the zoning ready for this? Have the costs for clearing land been considered and replacing and removing the old railroad ties to put in the high-speed rails? How about the public engagement? One of the biggest things when doing a project like this is setting the expectations right with the public. Has there been public forums? Has there been knowledge of the plans? Has the media covered this adequately? What's the acceptance rate with the public and the media for these kind of programs? And what's their willingness to pay? Do they have the patience to deal with the construction and the delays that'll happen to the current system when they're putting in the new system? Partnership with the federal government. Is the applicant familiar with the federal budgeting process and getting funds from them? Have they worked on other projects such as roads or bridges or airports? And what familiarity do they have with cooperation with a state or a city with the federal government? And then complementary infrastructure. Matt mentioned this briefly, but once we get a high-speed rail to take us someplace, How does the person get to their end destination? Are there other local trains or buses? Are zip cars going to be more popular? Do they have bike rentals, or is it close enough to walk and good enough temperature? Those are all factors that we need to consider in this application to make sure that we don't have a high-speed rail to nowhere with nothing to do. In conclusion, we've given you what we think are the best criteria to evaluate grant proposals. These 4 criteria can be analyzed and will help the FRC determine which of these projects will be best use of your federal funds. We believe that the FRC has been given a great opportunity to shape a new vision of America, America with high-speed rail. Deloitte's helped you with creating the evaluation criteria, and we'll be here to help you when you get the applications in to determine who's right for this program. Thank you for your time. We can answer any questions now.
Thank you. I have one question, and you touched on this, but I'm curious as to how much you think public or private investment is going to be a part of this process. You talked a fair amount about federal funding and state and local funding, but do you think that there will need to be a lot of private investment in order to bring this project home?
And it depends on how the public government sets it up for profit sharing, right? The private industry is a lot of times interested in what's their bottom line. So if they make a presentation, and it depends on the locale and how much infrastructure they have in line already, right? In places with Amtrak, for example, on the East Coast, it might make more sense versus places where they don't have high-speed rails sponsored by Amtrak and it's federal. So it depends on the existing infrastructure of the private, and then it's going to have to be a case-by-case, right? It's a relative subjective judgment once those applications come in, because in some cases it does make sense to have private industries involved, and in other cases it might be too much of a stretch to have them involved.
I have a question, and it's not, this is it's not entirely related to the proposal scoring process, but I think it was it Matthew, you talked about the stakeholders, and I'm really concerned about the media and the message to the stakeholders. If you, and I know it wasn't required as part of this, but how would you propose we would communicate with the stakeholder groups that you've identified, and given any thought as to what the most important messages to those groups would be to avoid us getting a black eye for this?
Transparency is extremely critical in these large capital projects that are going to be there for years to come. And that's why we talked about public hearings, making sure that the public has an opportunity. And if Congress knows that the public has an opportunity to weigh in on this, they're going to be in more support, given that their constituents had a voice. So I think it's making sure that we have as many people coming in and discussing exactly how we can proceed forward. Definitely a grassroots effort, going from the ground up. If you can lay that foundation, especially within the locality or the state that want to really propose this transit, that's where you're going to get it. And again, FRC, I think, should be focused on ownership of these programs. So the media coverage will be able to focus on the state and local entities more so, because they'll have more of a stake.
I think we're good. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.